La Marcia del Dolore. That was what the old Italians called it. The March of Sorrow. The day had come to deal with the mortal remains of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Their struggle of 7 long, bitter years with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a struggle that had been both legal and political, had finally ended with the electrocution of the 2 men for the crimes of robbery and murder on August 23, 1927. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti had been dedicated and militant anarchists. They had often declared their ideas openly. They had proudly defended their beliefs many times, both in public and in court. In the end, many thought the 2 men had been executed, not for the crimes for which they had been convicted, but for the political principles that they had held. The bodies of the 2 men were brought from the execution chamber of the Charlestown State Prison to the nearby Suffolk County Mortuary, and from there to the Langone Funeral Home on Hanover Street in the North End, the Italian quarter of Boston. There the bodies remained for 3 days, during which many thousands of mourners formed in long lines to file past the open caskets of the 2 men. The day of the funeral, Sunday, August 28, 1927, was reported by the Boston newspapers to be a gray, misty day, cool for that time of year. Since early that morning, many people had started to gather in the North End. They gathered under the suspicious and watchful eyes of great numbers of police, every imaginable kind of police. The Harbor Patrol deployed its small flotilla of police boats, guarding all maritime approaches to Boston, protecting it from any possible naval attack. Undercover detectives infiltrated South Station, the city's biggest and busiest railroad terminal, looking very carefully for dangerous, threatening persons who might be carrying bombs. It was quite clear the day had come to deal with the mortal remains of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. The struggle over the lives of the 2 men had finally ended, but now it turned into a struggle over the manner in which their remains would find their final resting place, a struggle over what route through the twisted streets of Boston would the remains of Sacco and Vanzetti travel to find their final resting place. Everyone, friend, adversary, bystander, knew the funeral would be a highly charged public confrontation, a confrontation between the anarchists and the authorities. Each side wanted to make a certain statement. The anarchists wanted to honor the struggle of their fallen comrades. They wanted to acknowledge the long and tremendous struggle of Sacco and Vanzetti for freedom, for justice, for life. The authorities, on the other hand, wanted to show that they could maintain public order on the streets of Boston. They wanted to show that they could restrain dangerous political dissent, as they considered any public support for the 2 men to be. As a final act of defiance, the anarchists had wanted to parade the hearses of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti in front of the State House. But the authorities, from one of their many informers, had learned of their intentions. To forestall any such attempt, they dug up Park Street, the street that led to the State House, and blocked it with trucks full of sand. They even put up barbed wire barricades on it. In a last spiteful act, the authorities also forbade the mourners the use of a band for the funeral. The funeral procession was formed initially along the harbor side at North End Park. The mourners numbered in the tens of thousands. From Commercial Street, the procession swung right onto Hanover Street and paused opposite the Langone Funeral Home, where the pallbearers carried the bodies of Sacco and Vanzetti out from the funeral parlor onto the waiting hearses. The hearses were very ornate, the very best the undertaker had. Originally, Mr. Langoni had even dressed the men in tuxedos. Horrified comrades made him put the bodies of Sacco and Vanzetti back into plain suits. Nonetheless, Mr. Langoni, the undertaker, kept his tuxedo on during the entire funeral. The crowd kept growing larger. The police had warned that if the marchers displayed any political signs or disrespectful placards, this would lead to arrests and to the breaking up of the procession. The funeral cortege could proceed only under the armed escort of a full complement of mounted police. As the mourners began to follow the floral displays and the hearses, the marchers in the front ranks suddenly broke out armbands and wrapped them around their arms. In dark black ink against a field of bright red, one could clearly see the words, "Justice Crucified, August 22nd, 1927. Although their clear and forceful warnings had not been obeyed, the police did not attempt to stop the determined-looking marchers. The procession reached the end of Hanover Street, and at Scully Square was just about ready to turn left onto Tremont Street. But they were approaching Park Street, the street that led to the State House, the street that had been torn up and blocked with trucks full of sand. To make it quite clear that this was the street, a route they could not take, the mounted police charged into the mourners at Scully Square and clubbed them. They tried to stop the mourners from marching behind the funeral procession. Yet the funeral cortege continued for another 8 long miles, now in the steady pouring rain, through the South End, through Roxbury, finally arriving in Jamaica Plain at the Forest Hill Cemetery. Just before reaching the cemetery, the police forced the procession to speed up. Once again, the police tried to discourage the still numerous marchers from following the hearses. Once again, the mounted police attacked the procession. Forest Hill Cemetery had been chosen for a particular reason. It had a crematorium. Sacco and Vanzetti had been the first prisoners to die in Massachusetts, as the commonplace says, without the benefit of clergy. To make their strongly held convictions even more clear, Sacco and Vanzetti chose not only to die without the last rites of any church, but they also chose to be cremated, a choice that went strongly against Catholic practice at that time. It was their final avowal of their anarchist beliefs, an act that upset many religious persons, including Vanzetti's own sister, who believed such an act to be sacrilegious. The funeral of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, according to all newspaper accounts, attracted as many as 200,000 onlookers. The police reported a crowd of 10 to 20,000. The authorities had hoped that the funeral procession would mark the end of the Sacco-Vanzetti case. Instead, the March of Sorrow marked the beginning of efforts that continue until this day to honor the ideals and the memory of the two men. These efforts have turned the Sacco-Vanzetti case into the case that will not die. As a historical postscript, it should be noted that federal and state authorities were very determined to diminish any impact of the Sacco-Vanzetti case upon American society and American history. They saw the Sacco-Vanzetti case as too dangerous and too disturbing a presence for their idea of America. Both here and abroad, they were determined to remove any notice, any mention of the case from any account that dealt with 20th century America. At this time, the principal source of news for many people throughout the world was the newsreel business, a tremendously successful business in which American companies dominated. Within days after the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, federal authorities, primarily the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Department of Justice, along with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, pressured Hollywood to destroy all the documentary film footage about the Sacco-Vanzetti case that it had in its possession. Hollywood complied, all too enthusiastically, all too shamelessly, all too efficiently. As a result, only a few odd minutes of newsreel film survived this little-known cinema holocaust, the first such in film history. The funeral footage you have seen survives only because it was commissioned and saved by the Sacco-Vanzetti Defense Committee. Only in this way did this Sacco-Vanzetti funeral footage escape the shameful film burning, a film burning that still to this day has never been acknowledged openly by Hollywood, not treated fully by film historians, or indeed any historian. And so, it is through the efforts of the Sacco-Vanzetti Defense Committee that La Marcia del Dolore, the March of Sorrow, the funeral of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, the tragic beginning of the case that will not die, can still be seen on film today.